On January 28th of 2020, 5 years ago today, the Savitz family lost a beloved brother and father, Andrew Savitz. Throughout the course of this trial, you are going to hear that Mr. Savitz passed away after an altercation with his ex-wife, the defendant before you today, Penelope McGee. You are going to hear throughout this trial that Mr. Savitz was in quite ill health, having suffered a stroke, been in 2 car accidents, he had diabetes and was experiencing memory loss and trouble with his peripheral vision. But most notably, Your Honor, Mr. Savitz suffered from severe cardiovascular disease, including a 90% stenosis of the right coronary artery. You will learn about Mr. Savitz through his brother John, or about Mr. Savitz's medical condition, through his brother John Savitz, 4 sets of medical records that Your Honor will have a chance to review, including Beth Israel records from an auto accident, the Jocelyn Diabetes Center, his treatment at Mass Ioneer and the Newton Wellesley Hospital, as well as you will hear about his condition from the medical examiner that performed the autopsy, Dr. Rebecca Diedrich. You will also hear from Andrew Savitz's brother, John Savitz, that Ms. McGee was aware of all of these conditions and the ill health of Mr. Andrew Savitz on the date of this incident. You will see emails and text messages to John Savitz from Penelope McGee updating him on Andy's various conditions, medical conditions, medications, and medical appointments. You will also hear that Ms. McGee was the healthcare proxy to Mr. Andrew Savitz. Then you're going to hear from Andrew Savitz's daughter, Susie Savitz. She's going to tell you what she saw happen that night on January 28th of 2020. Susie heard her mother come over to the home at 40 Meadowbrook Road in Brookline, where she was living with her father and her younger brother, Harry. Susie Savitz heard her parents arguing that night when her mother came to the house. And she could hear yelling and screaming. And when she went downstairs, she could see that her parents were in an argument. She heard something break, which we later found out, the court will find out, was a ceramic bowl. You'll see pictures of that broken bowl. But Susie's going to tell you she heard something break, and she went back upstairs to get her phone to call 911. She's going to tell you that she got her phone from her bedroom, called 911, and as she was coming down the stairs, she could see her parents in the hallway by the end of the stairs at the house towards the front door, and she saw her mother hitting and shoving her father against a wall where there was a sliding closet, and you're going to hear the 911 call, Your Honor. You're going to hear Susie telling her parents to stop, and then in the middle of that phone call, Susie's going to tell you she heard she saw her father collapse to the ground, and Ms. McGee started trying to give him CPR. Susie was calling the ambulance to come quickly. The paramedics arrived. The Brookline police arrived. You're going to hear from the paramedic. You're going to hear from the responding officer from the Brookline police, all of whom tried to administer CPR. And tried to resuscitate Mr. Savitz. Mr. Savitz was brought to the Beth Israel Hospital, where you're going to hear from the emergency room doctor that also treated him and tried to revive him, and ultimately pronounced him deceased at 12:14 a.m. In the early morning hours of January 29th of 2020. Lastly, Your Honor, you are going to hear from the medical examiner, Dr. Rebecca Diedrich. Dr. Diedrich is going to explain to you how Mr. Savitz's conditions prevented his heart from handling the fight or flight response that was happening during the altercation with Ms. McGee. Dr. Diedrich is going to tell you her opinion as to what the official cause of death was of Mr. Andrew Savitz. She's going to explain that her opinion is that he suffered from cardiac dysrhythmia following an altercation in a person with hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and diabetes mellitus. Andrew Savitz was in ill health. His diabetes and cardiovascular disease was severe, and Penelope McGee knew it. Despite Mr. Savitz's condition, Ms. McGee went over to his house on the night of January 28, 2020. She was yelling and screaming, hitting and shoving him. His heart couldn't handle the stress of the altercation, and he collapsed and passed away. After you hear all of this evidence, Your Honor, I am confident that you will find Penelope McGee guilty as charged.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that was the state's open. You're going to see these a lot briefer than we would in a jury trial, right? Because this is a bench trial. Judge Cannoni is familiar with these facts, right? She's got the court file. She knows what this case is about. Now she's going to hear from the defense in a couple of minutes. We're going to hit our break. When we come back, we'll go back in together live. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julie Grant. Let's go back into the courtroom in Massachusetts, Judge Beverly Cannoni's courtroom, that is. We're having a bench trial here. The crime of manslaughter is what the Commonwealth is accusing this defendant of doing. Now it's time to hear from her defense attorney.
The evidence will show that Ms. McGee was married to the deceased for approximately 15 years, and they divorced about 6 years before this incident. That nonetheless, the evidence will show that they continued to work together to raise 3 children, get their children into college. They talked frequently, almost daily sometimes. At some point, Ms. McGee moved into a home that was owned by the brother-in-laws of the deceased. It was in Brookline. It was close by. It was close by the Meadowbrook home where Mr. Savitz also resided. She lived there in Randolph with her 3 children. At some point, the brother-in-laws chose to evict her. They did so. That eviction was formalized on January 3rd, 2020. During that same time, in the days leading up to January 3rd, you'll hear evidence that both Mr. Savitz and Ms. McGee worked continually together as they sought to get their daughter Susie in college. They talked frequently. She ran errands for him, he ran errands for her. At that time, January 3rd of 2020, he was working, he was traveling, he was enjoying his life. One of his things he liked to do was gamble. He did that. He was functioning. He also texted, and the evidence will show that he invited Ms. McGee to reside at Meadowbrook while she looked for other housing. But there was an issue. The evidence will show that there was a significant issue of the relationship that had deteriorated between Ms. McGee and her daughter. So there was an arrangement made. She could not appear at Meadowbrook unless her daughter was up in her room and in bed, maybe studying. And they both abided by it. Backing up a little bit, you'll hear that around August 18th of 2019, Mr. Savitz told his ex-wife he'd been in a car accident, a serious one. The car was totaled. He went to the hospital. Medical records that we introduced into evidence will show that he didn't listen to medical advice. And in fact, in the words of the hospital records, he eloped. He left. Ms. McGee found out about it, talked to her ex-husband, got him an immediate appointment at his personal care physician, Dr. Mann. Got in to see Dr. Mann within a day. Dr. Mann said, I think he has some problems or words of that effect that are contained in the medical records, and recommended that Mr. Savitz go to the emergency room because of cognitive issues and a question of whether he'd suffered a stroke. They did that. Who did that? Ms. McGee. She took him immediately to the emergency room. Any question about whether Ms. McGee knew about certain medical conditions of Mr. Savitz is somewhat beside the point, because the evidence will show that she cared for him for days and weeks following the car accident and the diagnosis of stroke. She moves in. She's allowed to stay in Penelope. She's allowed to stay in her older son's bedroom upstairs with that condition that the evidence will show. Her older son, Noah, had now left home to go to college at Drexel in Pennsylvania. On January 20th, Mr. Savitz was in yet another car accident, this time while he was driving their younger son, Harry. He reported it to his brother-in-laws, and the evidence will show that Miss McGee was worried about that, concerned about that. Notwithstanding that they totaled in the accident, Mr. Savitz totaled his son Noah's car, but the fact that Harry was in the car, the younger son. And so she had a discussion, and there will be evidence about that. Importantly, though, the evidence will show that with regards to the causation and manner of death, as the Commonwealth just told the court it expects to introduce, the relevant literature says that the physiological issue that Dr. Diedrich will testify to can occur as a result of motor vehicle accidents. Because it's the way the body responds hormonally to the stress associated with such an event. So there is a car accident, a serious one in August, where a car is totaled, but there is no heart attack. There is no cardiac arrest. There's a second motor vehicle accident on January 20th. There is no cardiac event. Why is that important? Because when you look at the hundreds, if not thousands of pages of records that are already introduced, or we agreed to introduce them in total, you won't see one reference in hundreds of pages of any complaints about chest pain, fibrillation, any diagnosis of cardiac issues other than high blood pressure, sometimes referred to as hypertension. That's it. No medication, no complaints from Mr. Savitz about anything wrong with his heart other than the high blood pressure. Why is all this important? Because the evidence will show that Miss McGee cared for Mr. Savitz and got him back into good health, and then interacted with him as if he was in good health. And she took pains to make sure he was in good health. And so it contradicts what the evidence the Commonwealth presumes to admit and presumes to state, that she conducted herself that night on January 28th of 2020 with a disregard for the likelihood that her conduct would result in substantial harm. What happened that night? Text messages show that about 7:30 on January 28th, there was a communication between Mr. Savitz and Miss McGee. He said, I'm paraphrasing now, but the evidence will show that he said, I expect you to come over. Would you take your shoes off when you climb up the stairs? And that was all part of that arrangement, where Miss McGee could stay up in Noah's room as long as Susie was not, the daughter, was not in her room. Because there was this friction. And also during the day, the text messages will show that Mr. Savitz made some very upsetting and disparaging remarks to Miss McGee as he rehashed the eviction. And it upset her. But it was just more of the same, and they worked through this before, as the text messages show. And so she drove over there, parked her car, went in to see if Susie was upstairs before she could go inside, and she was upstairs. The evidence will show that Mr. Savitz then asked Ms. McGee, sit down on the living room couch, watch TV. They started to do that. They had some conversations about some behavioral issues with Susie. And that's when Mr. Savitz began to become upset. The evidence will show that then the conversation turned to this text where Mr. Savitz had somewhat ridiculed Ms. McGee about the eviction from Randolph Street. And that is when he told Ms. McGee to get out of the house. And he raised his voice. And he demanded that she leave. And Ms. McGee got up from the living room couch, was headed to her coat. It was laid over the back of the couch back. And before she could reach it, Mr. Savitz grabbed her at some point on her body and pushed her into the living room wall that you'll see in so many of the photographs. Then what ensued after that was a yelling match where Mr. Savitz demanded she leave and began to push her into the kitchen area, pushed her against some tables that contained, as the photographs show, any number of dishes. And one such dish fell over and apparently smashed onto the floor. And he continued to push her. And he continued to grab her. And the path that he was making was a path directly to the front door. And now he was grabbing her hair. And he pushed her against the refrigerator. He pushed her into the area of the stove. All of which, as he was pushing her toward the front door. And now he had a hold of her body. He had a hold of her hair. And he was simply trying to get her out of the house. And she was moving backwards, not understanding what was happening. All of this happening in a short period of time, with yelling and chaos. And as she tried to defend herself, and only defend herself, Mr. Savitz collapsed. Where does he collapse? He collapsed right near the front door. The front door that he was pushing and fighting Miss McGee. He collapsed. He fell to the ground. And what did Miss McGee do? The evidence will show part of it coming from the 911 call made by her daughter.
Oh boy, so he's saying this is a self-defense case, that she was defending herself. Oh boy, more to come in the defense opening statement here. We're going to hit a break. We'll be right back live after this.
Grieving widow or mastermind behind a murder.
Monica Cimentelli is accused of plotting to kill her husband.
Famed celebrity hairstylist Fabio Cimentelli.
Prosecutors say she and her lover killed Fabio to collect a big life insurance policy.
The defense may say she's a bad woman, but she wouldn't be involved in a murder.
It's a whodunit Hollywood story, but will there be a twist that no one sees?
The celebrity stylist murder trial, today, only on Court TV.
Back to court we go in Massachusetts. The defense team delivering opening statements in the Socialite Manslaughter trial.
Changed her findings. And as a result of that, the allegations against that particular person charged with the death of Aston Trooper was, in the parlance of legal terms, no cause. They ended the prosecution. This is the same medical examiner that made her conclusions in this case. The evidence will show that the relevant literature that tried to address this so-called phenomena referred to as homicide by heart attack, that starting in 1978 required strict criteria to be applied by medical examiners in trying to reach the same conclusion that Dr. Diedrich reached. And then there is a 2002 guide for medical examiners that the evidence will show that is the only thing that Dr. Diedrich apparently relied on that tells medical examiners really nothing at all. And then you'll hear evidence that the relevant literature, published 2 years later, in 2004, authored by Dr. Turner, revisits the strict criteria to be applied in these so-called homicide by heart attack cases where there is a physical touching. And one of their criteria is to determine the intent of the actor, that what the actor did to cause the harm was criminal. That's what the evidence will show. And yet, the evidence will show that this case is about self-defense, being attacked. The relevant literature will also talk about the stress reaction occurring, as I stated a minute ago, motor vehicle accidents, but also anger on behalf of the deceased in situations. Anger triggers the same physiological response that Dr. Diedrich talks about, that she rests on finding her opinion and making a homicide finding. Respectfully, Judge, we believe that once you've considered all of the evidence and all the testimony, that based on the science, and based on the lack of reliable assessments made by Dr. Diedrich, you will find Ms. McGee not guilty. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.